Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 7th webinar in our series addressing the legal impacts of coronavirus on K-12 schools. My name is Jackie Gharapour Wernz, and I'm joined today by our panel you've come to know and love. We have Dana Fattore Crumley.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Jennifer Smith.
Good afternoon.
Nicki Bazer.
Hi, everyone.
And Shelli Anderson.
Hey, everybody.
And we're thrilled to welcome Jim Franczek to join us today as our special guest. Jim needs no introduction as the president and name partner of our firm. We are excited to hear his perspective as someone who has represented school districts in Illinois and across the country for almost 50 years, and also serves as Chief Labor Counsel for the City of Chicago and the Chicago Public Schools. Welcome, Jim.
I'm thrilled to be on this, and for those of you who've been watching this program, I want you to know that being a guest on this is one of the most sought after privileges in my law firm. So I'm happy that I finally attained this status. So thank you, Jackie, and thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. It's great to have you, Jim. So before we jump into questions, as usual, I'm going to cover some housekeeping notices as always. If you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to do so. We aren't really able to answer raised hands or chat questions, so please put your Q&A down there at that link. We're going to start with some insights, mostly from Jim, followed by a discussion of questions we received prior to the webinar. And then we'll tackle any questions you submit through the Q&A function during the latter half of our discussion today. As always, if you find yourself still looking for more information, or if we're not able to get to your question today, please reach out to one of us for information. Please also check out our website at franczek.com, where you can find our COVID-19 Resource Center full of webinars, alerts, blogs, and podcasts. Make sure to subscribe to our alerts as we are regularly adding more material on coronavirus and many other legal issues facing schools. Okay, we're going to start with Jim giving us a little bit of a statewide perspective. So first of all, Jim, we know you've been working with school districts a long time and that we are experiencing something right now that is completely unprecedented. Can you give us your 2 minutes of thoughts on how you see districts and educators and students and parents weathering this storm?
Well, let me just very briefly try to set a little context and a little texture. What we're going through now, and I've been privileged to work with school districts for literally 51 years now, is literally terrifying. We've never been through anything like this. The result of where we're going to end up will make public education in this state totally different than it was before this pandemic. I want to share with you some observations about where I think we are and where we're going. But suffice it to say, to start with, that what school districts have been doing is nothing short of phenomenal so far. And as we get into this discussion, there's a tendency that it might become overwhelming. We have a galaxy of webinars, of information that is just being flooded on us from time to time. Of course, these webinars are by far the most informative of anything you're going to be able to get. But it can get quickly depressing very, very quickly. So one of my heroes, and I think my 5 colleagues will probably roll their eyes a little bit and say, there he goes again. But one of my heroes is Winston Churchill, and I love his quotes. And one of my favorite in this point in time is, a pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. An optimist sees opportunity in every difficulty. So as we go through this, we're going to have enormous difficulty. But my strong suggestion to you is look at it as an opportunity to do things that otherwise you wouldn't be able to do. So let's go a little bit to the next step and be a bit more specific. In my view, in discussions with state leaders, with business people, with the city of Chicago, with a whole different array of people, I think this is all going to break out into sort of 3 stages. One is what we're going through right now, the immediate. What do you do? How do you handle graduations? How do you handle testing? What are you doing with special ed? My 5 colleagues have done a wondrous job navigating through all of those questions. Part 2 is going to be the recovery. Hopefully in a few weeks, a few months, we're going to start to get our society back to something that approaches normalcy, although it's never going to be as normal as it was before this. And the third step, which I want to talk a little bit about, is the rebuilding. How do we take public education, build on what we got, and go from there? So I look to my 5 colleagues to intersperse this with questions as we go forward. But big picture wise, this is sort of the beginning of the beginning. It's not even the end of the beginning. It's the beginning of the beginning, to paraphrase again Winston Churchill. And I think I want to take a few moments to just talk about what the world is going to look like in a month, 2 months, 3 months, in a year, in 2 years. And at least in my mind, there are sort of 4 intersecting but distinct silos or issues. One is education. How do you provide public education going forward? And that's not an easy question. 2 is, how do you make it happen? What are the operational aspects of providing public education? 3 is funding. How are we going to fund this? I mean, as all of you know, and it's just a mind-boggling statistic, but we have 30 million people as of this morning who are unemployed in the United States. That's literally more than there was during the Great Depression. You know, we obviously have more people nowadays, but that's still a staggering number. The gross national product just went down yesterday, almost 5%, 4.8%. That again is the most since the Great Depression. It's even more than 2008. The implications for that for public school funding are enormous. And the 4th sort of silo, and my favorite, because this is where I've only spent 50 years of my life, is labor relations, which is going to change dramatically. And these all intersect, and that's what makes it complex, and that would make it difficult. You can't talk about the educational related issues without also talking about how do you make it happen, where you're going to get the money, and how do you deal with the unions. At the risk of just rambling on this, let's take a few concrete examples, and then I look to my colleagues for specific questions. But take something relatively simple. When schools reopen, and they will reopen at some point, and hopefully, let's say next year. Right now, you come to school and it's in-person education. If you listen to Dr. Fauci, who's become a folk hero for all of us, you're going to have probably another wave of this virus next fall or winter. You're certainly going to walk into a school and you're going to have to think about social distancing. You're going to have to think about PPE. You're going to have to think about testing. You're going to have to think about a whole array of issues. So just envision a classroom. And right now that classroom has in it 20 desks or 20 stations, all right? Next year, you're not going to have 20 desks or 20 stations. You're going to have to separate those. And maybe you have 10 in order to accommodate them into a room. So what does that mean? Do you provide more classrooms? That costs money. Do you stagger the shifts so that you bring kids in at different points of time? And that's an issue that's been debated literally across the country, including Illinois. You're going to have, as one option, staggered shifts. Think about that a moment. Who's going to stagger? How do you choose who's going to be in what shifts? What about the parents? Are they going to come in different shifts? How do you choose the shifts for those parents? What about the busing? How do you put busing on different kinds of operations? How about the custodial problems? You're going to have more rooms, different schedules. How about nurses and counselors? If you're doing testing, if you're doing PPE, if you're doing safe, the increase in all of that is going to be substantial, and it's going to cost enormous amounts of money. Spend a moment just in the state of Illinois, because this really, and this is why I did the Churchill quote at the beginning, because I want you to have some degree of optimism about this, because most of what I'm going to say is very, very depressing. So at the state level, right now the governor projects he's going to be down this fiscal year at least $8 billion. There's a great discussion about whether or not we can fund EBF with the 350 mil we talked about prior to this pandemic. The governor, and I think he's done a terrific job, he's been very honest in saying, I don't know. The pension, and I want to get this out there because this is something that's going to be a major, major problem. In terms of all the state funds, we are $174 billion in unfunded liability right now. That's a staggering, staggering sum. And we passed laws in the last couple of years that mandate payments at the state and the local level. If those payments are going to continue to be made, where does it come from? Well, next to social services, the biggest part of the budget is public education. What are you going to do with it? And then you get to my favorite topic, labor relations. Right now, and this may be hard to believe, we're in the glory period right now. Everybody is scared, nervous, anxious. For the most part, with some exceptions, the unions have been cooperative. We've been working with them. They haven't been all that bad, even in the great Chicago public school system, which would, without debate, take the award for being the most difficult union in the state of Illinois. If you have a more difficult union, let me know because you have my sympathy. But even they have been relatively cooperative. But that's going to change. As you go into stage 2, as you go into stage 3, you're going to end up with 3 kinds of union responses. Many school districts, you'll have a cooperative relationship, you'll work through things. At the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have school districts where it's going to be an extremely antagonistic, resistant relationship. And in between, which are going to be most of the school districts, there's going to be a tension, there's going to be an anxiety, you're going to have speed bumps, but not brick walls as you walk through these issues. There's going to be a built-in tension as to what management wants and what unions are going to be asking for. You're going to see them making a huge argument, and this is happening right now at the state level, to relax a lot of the mandates on assessments, evaluations, more time in the classroom, how you're going to provide this. But it's also going to get a lot more down to earth. Go back and take my example of the classroom that's going from 20 to 10. Are you going to hire more nurses? That's what the unions are going to ask you to do. You're going to have people that will have to do testing and take temperatures when folks come into the school building. Who's going to do that? Are they going to be a member of your paraprofessional union? Are you going to hire more? What about the teachers that come in? Are you going to buy them more supplies, PPE, etc.? There's going to be a host of issues. And back up a second, because this is vitally important as we move forward. You know, I was there in 1984 when we wrote the Illinois Educational Labor Relations Act. And the predicate of that act was based on 1950s and 1960s industrial labor law, okay? You negotiate over wages, hours, and other terms and conditions. That's exactly the language of the National Labor Relations Act. And that's what we incorporated into public education. The labor laws in this state, and if there's any union folks listening in on this, I hope they're hearing it, they're not made to deal with what we're going through. They're not.
Jim, this is making me think so much. My head is just spinning.
Good.
Considering all these competing interests that you've highlighted so well for us, like what legislation do you see coming? I mean, you were there for the ILRA, but now all these things facing us, what legislation do you see coming through?
Well, there's going to be, and that's a very good question. Again, it goes back to my 4 silos. Take number 1, education. There's going to be, and nobody can predict, and I don't pretend to, exactly what's going to come out. But since everybody probably on this webinar wants to know what's going to happen tomorrow. The General Assembly in the month of May, if they meet for more than 2 or 3 days, and they have to meet physically just to figure out how they're going to meet virtually, all right, which is another irony of all of this. But at most, I'm told, you'll have a 2 or 3 day session in the month of May. And there's going to be a lot of bills that are pent up that will need to be dealt with, okay? Medicare, all sorts of things, the budget, school funding, everything else. And there's going to be a bunch of bills that we're going to need to address to deal with this pandemic. You know, it's very well in the realm of possibility. There may be a bill that gives the governor authority to start and continue to stay at home. That's possible. So this is going to have, to answer your question specifically, Dana, at least 2 parts. Part 1 is going to be what they're going to have to deal with immediately in May. That's the easy part. The hard part is going to be what happens in the fall and in the veto session. And that's going to have a couple of components. One is, how do you make up for the time you lost? All right. School districts are losing 1/3 of the school year approximately this year with the schools being closed. So one piece of legislation that's being seriously considered, and nobody can predict what happens, is what do you do to make up the time? Do you extend the year? Do you extend the day? And then there's funding.
Right. That's what I was thinking about, extended year, extended day. I mean, could it be possible that the legislature would set the school calendar rather than having individual school districts set it?
It is, as we all know, those of us who have been in public education for a long time, the state of Illinois values enormously local control of public education. We have 850 school districts in the state. Those school districts vary enormously between and among each other. However, there's no ifs, ands, or buts that making up the time, dealing with the funding, and dealing with the labor issues. And remember, you can't divorce these 3 one from the other. They need to be talked about in conjunction with themselves. So if you're assuming that you have statewide funding, if you're assuming, as I think you do, that you need to modify the labor laws to accommodate this, then, you know, at the state level, you're going to have to come up with something. Now, right now, we do set by statute, as everybody knows, the minimum school year. So there's nothing particularly outrageous about the General Assembly figuring out a way to extend the school year. The hard part becomes, how do you fund it? And what do you negotiate with your unions about it? Because extending it is one thing, but doing the implementation is another. By one estimate, if you extended the year by the equivalent of 1 week, and remember, we've lost almost 3 months now. If you extended it by 1 week statewide, that's almost $1 billion in additional cost. In other words, if you were just to take the direct correlation between the increase in time and what operating and teacher costs are right now, statewide, that would be $1 billion. We don't have $1 billion.
So one thing, Nikki, just to jump in, I mean, I do think we're moving though from a period where maybe time was lost to a transition, and what you're talking about, Jim, where we're home, but I don't know that we consider it as much lost time. We're getting better at supporting kids at home. So hopefully, as we get further into this, yeah, we might have lost some instructional time at the beginning, but if this pandemic is going to continue, we have to get better at serving kids where they are,
And
not just let it continue.
And that's part of it. And that's part of the debate that's going on right now, is the efficacy of remote learning. And it could very well turn out the case, being the way the world is, that trying to add time on a statewide basis is just too difficult an issue to tackle. And the world being what it is, you have a balance. And part of the balance is exactly what you just talked about. Look, if we can't afford, if we can't do an extension of time, then what do? You got to make remote learning better, more effective than what it currently is. And although there's lots of places that are doing it amazingly well, it's also true that there's lots of places that aren't doing it amazingly well. And one of the big issues, and this ought to be on everybody's radar screen, and you've seen it in the press, it's not a surprise, but trust me, it's a topic of great discussion at the state level, is the whole issue of equity and gaps in public education. It's no secret that those that have been most adversely affected by all of this are those that are least able to afford it. And that's going to be a major issue going forward, not just from the unions, but from a lot of groups. African-American, Latino communities, low-income communities have suffered most greatly by this pandemic. And there's lots of people, well-intended and smart, that look at this pandemic as a way to which to make advances in the huge disparities we have in public education in this state. So the good news is you're in for a real ride right now, and there will be revolutionary changes. The topics that you guys are identifying are definitely there on the agenda. And like all things in the state of Illinois, at or near the top of that list is money. Where do you get the money from? Individual school districts, and Ayers did a terrific job. I listened to his too. But funding on an individual school basis is going to be enormously difficult, all right? We fund public schools by property taxes. Well, you know, you have the greatest unemployment and business closings in the history of the state of Illinois. That's going to affect school districts. Will we get money from the federal government? Probably. But it won't be nearly enough to cover this. One of the topics, Dana, to answer your question specifically, is you go back to pensions, which is by far the biggest elephant in the room. What are you going to do with it? You can't even fund public education at a minimum with the outstanding pension debt that we have, which is even getting greater. So what do?
Jim, I wanted to pick
Let me
up.
finish this one thought, because
Sure.
this is important, is do you do a pension holiday? And think about that for a few minutes, okay? We've gone through pension holidays in this state for a long time, but are we about to go through another one? And that's a topic that's being seriously discussed in Springfield right now too. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I definitely wanted to just touch base on something that you mentioned that I think is so critically important, the equity issue. And I know earlier you mentioned the CTU and sort of the difficulty, although I've been at the table with the CTU recently on some of these remote learning issues. And I think we've had some really productive and important conversations with the CTU as partners about the equity issues. Certainly you see those acutely within the city of Chicago, but we see them in school districts around the country. And obviously the goal is to make remote learning work for all students in all situations. And I think our unions have really tried to be a partner in that process. But just pivoting slightly, we're obviously out of school until the end of the year. Are you hearing anything at the state level about how or when things might reopen? I know you had talked about staggered schedules or the possibility of that. Do you have any insight at this point, or are we all sort of still awaiting?
Everybody is assuming that we're going to have in-person learning in some manner or form come the fall. The first and immediate, to answer your question, is summer school. What are we doing with summer school? And that's very much up in the air. Whether or not there's in-person learning in the fall, and this gets to be and this goes back to Jennifer's observation about the efficacy of remote learning. But the anxiety about whether or not we're able to provide safety to students, to teachers, to staff coming into schools in the fall is a major, major issue. And there's a great concern, and it's gotten very little publicity, that this virus is going to come around and hit us in the rear end again next fall or next winter. So imagine the scenario, which everybody wants to see happen right now, where you have in-person learning come August or September. You figure out how to do with all of the kinds of protections you're going to need, which are enormous. You figure out the staggered schedules, you figure out the classroom, you figure out all that stuff. And all of a sudden, come October and November, and we're right back where we are a week or 2 or 3 ago. All right. The consequences for that are just almost unimaginable. So what the policymakers are thinking their way through is, we don't know what's going to happen, but we have to have plans to take into consideration the worst case scenario. So right now, everybody hopes, everybody's planning in-person education come the fall. Now let's figure out how we're going to do it. But plan B is, holy cow, we better figure out remote learning too, because in one way or another, that's going to be with us for a long time to come. So those things sort of tie themselves in together. And, you know, you listen to the governor, there's an enormous amount of time that's spent on the immediacy of what you do now. But I think you should all take some comfort that there's a good number of extremely intelligent people, of which I don't count myself, who are thinking about the long-term consequences.
So Jim, we did get a question from a member of our audience that might be a good one for you to address. What about a potential property tax freeze or a pension cost shift if the fair tax amendment doesn't pass in the fall? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about pension consolidation for about 40 or 50 years now. It's sort of like school district consolidation, okay? We're all the way down to 850 school districts now. Isn't that a real accomplishment? Yeah, so the whole pension issue, and I know that we have in this webinar folks from across the state of Illinois, but there's a lot of thought being given to not only a pension holiday, but how much of a holiday and where the holiday. And do you do the holiday more for downstate? How do you do the holiday with avoiding the enormous long-term consequences of increasing unfunded liability down the road? So that gets into re-amortizing. That gets into freezing property taxes. That gets into pension consolidation. We did a bill, the governor did before this all started, to consolidate some of the operational aspects of the state pension funds. And although that's a good first step, it is barely a first step. Give you one example. We've been talking about consolidating the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund with the State Teacher Pension Fund for a long time now. So under the heading of a guy I worked with for 8 years, never let a good crisis go to waste, that issue is going to be discussed a whole lot more seriously now, because that will save literally billions of dollars over the next few years. That's one example. So to answer the question, and nobody can answer it with great difficulty, but there's a lot of thought being given how you're going to be able to do this. There's no way, none, that we can do what we need to do next year without addressing the pension problem. It's just not going to happen. You can't come up with the money otherwise.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you so much. We appreciate you being here with us today and sharing your unparalleled perspective on these pressing issues for schools. We are going to jump into some questions that we received during the registration process, and then we will take Q&A questions with our last 15 minutes or so today. So please do submit your questions if you have any.
Well, thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
So now some questions for our panel. So first off, Jen, the U.S. Department of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos just requested a waiver regarding 3-year-old evaluations. Can you explain the waiver process and what this means for districts?
Yes, as part of the CARES Act, the Secretary of Education was asked to give a report to Congress explaining if she recommended certain waivers. And this included on the federal law that governs IEPs and special education, and then Section 504. And we got the report this week. basically she said waivers are primarily not needed, and through grit and ingenuity, we can fully meet the obligations of IDEA and Section 504. With one minor, I think it's relatively minor exception to allow an extension of the timeline for early childhood evaluation. So when children transition at their 3-year-old birthday from early childhood services to school district services, they're letting kids basically stay on early childhood services until they can get that evaluation done if it requires an in-person evaluation. That is the only waiver that she's recommending. Other than that, she's saying her opinion is schools can manage. Now, Congress could independently decide and enact a change to IDEA, but without that recommendation from the secretary, obviously the chances of a major change is diminishing.
Yeah,
That makes-
I don't see any changes coming there anytime soon. I think it's sort of fallen off the list. And I think with her coming out with this, they're not gonna sort of revisit for a little while. It's unfortunate because I know it's an area of stress, and I don't think it's really reflective of the way special ed works in practice.
Right. I mean, I think what we're going to have to do now is argue that the flexibility within the FAPE standard and within the case law that's built up around IDEA allows for common sense changes to how special education works. So, I mean, we can talk about that in answering specific questions. So our default is going to be the law is still in place, so we have to comply with it. But can we be creative about what does that mean, though, in this new situation? And in some ways, I'm glad they didn't make minor waivers to FAPE that made it clear that you have to do, very prescriptive, that these large requirements still exist. Right now, I think we can just argue in the case law whatever flexibility we need, and it's going to be decided, case by case, due process by due process. So, yeah, there's not help on the way as far as I do not see it on changing the federal law, though.
Now, speaking of changes and guidance from lawmakers or from our legal entities, yesterday evening in State Superintendent Dr. Carmen Ayala's weekly message to school superintendents, ISB stated that no in-person graduation ceremonies of any kind are allowed. Shelli and Nicki, I know you've been fielding a lot of questions even in just the few hours since that message was released. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Well, I mean, I think Nicki and I probably have had similar requests or inquiries from clients related to, what now? Because there are many districts that we work with and others that we know of across the state who've come up with very clever ideas to celebrate students and still stay within the social distancing guidelines that have been put out by the governor. The idea, the premise, I should say, in the guidance that came out or in the statement that came out last night is that this is somehow a joint gathering that violates the governor's stay-at-home order. Some questions that we have that we're posing to both ISB and the governor's office is, how is it any different than having seniors or any other students come pick up their belongings out of their lockers in a school day? How is it any different than, kids who are coming to pick up lunches or meals on a staggered schedule? And I think that, saying just definitively no to everything without being reflective about what some of these districts have put into place for these kids to celebrate graduation may have been, a little too hasty. And that's my personal opinion. Nicki, I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
I really agree, Shelli. I'm always blown away by our school administrators, but the creativity with which they have approached this issue to try to bring something for seniors and their families who have lost really, a lot of the big milestones of the last part of their high school time. And, I do think that our districts have been really thoughtful, some of them, about how to do this in a way that's safe, but celebratory. And I think that this guidance is confusing given what you reference, how's this different than locker pickup? I talked to one district today where they're having their seniors do locker pickup in cap and gown and taking pictures of them. And that just seems like we're getting sort of into I applaud them for doing that. I just think ISB has caused a little bit of silliness here in terms of the lack of connection between what they're saying on one hand and the other. And so again, as you mentioned, we're in touch with ISB, we're in touch with the governor's office. We're hoping to get some answers, some clarity, maybe some carve outs so that the graduation ceremonies that are planned that are safe, that are not, groups of people coming together, but are, abiding by all of the social distancing, all of the stay-at-home provisions can take place.
Yeah, and I think also, sorry, I just want to say, I think the other thing is just in terms of my thought about it being hasty. I mean, I know that there's a lot of districts out there who are thinking, or ISB taking the position, well, we can do all the celebration afterward, in July, in August. And, I was talking to a superintendent yesterday who said, and I think he's right, perhaps these are people who've never been in charge of 700 kids who have nothing to lose. And at that point, you've got kids who've already graduated, who are on their way to doing whatever it is they're doing post-graduation, and putting them all together at that time, you are asking for an impossible situation for our administrators to keep them all together. And again, I'm not saying anything about the kids. I think they're all have, well-intentioned, but they're still kids. And it's, I think that we can do something now that's different, that's safe, as opposed to, trying to repeat something that might not be as meaningful later, is something we should be looking at. Jenna, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, I think this is where we might start to get into issues with ISB, where we need to look really carefully at, okay, what's guidance and what is legally mandated and what is the consequence of not following the guidance if it's not really appropriate for our community and in light of what we had planned. So I'm not suggesting, anarchy or we all, don't follow any guidance, but there does come a point where guidance is guidance and sometimes you consider it and you reject it, or you at least are thoughtful about what's the authority for this guidance and what are the requirements here and balance the risks that all of that poses.
Well, and as far as a question of how far does this go? I mean, does this apply just to graduations, or does it apply to other things like maybe a parade for students or something else that's not graduation? How far do we have to read into what ISB said yesterday?
I think the way it's currently written, it is specific in that it speaks to in-person graduation ceremonies, but the reasoning behind it related to it being some sort of violation of the group gatherings or gatherings under the executive order, I think that could arguably be read more broadly. And I don't know, where the authority for that is coming from and where we start to draw a line between, the silliness that would become of, and I know of districts like Nicki that'll be having kids pick up their stuff in their cap and gown and taking the picture there in an attempt to not, act in, out of compliance with what Dr. Alaya put out last night. So.
Yeah, and we got a comment, which I think is a good one, which is understanding that graduations, the concern that some school districts have about graduations specifically, garnering more attention. So relatives are coming, even though you say they shouldn't, that people are congregating around the school in an unsafe way. And yes, we hear you, and we certainly understand that those are the concerns that need to be addressed. And if I think districts should definitely, make determinations, and I think a lot of districts have, that this is not something that they can, given the setup of their school, given the circumstances, it's just not a situation that they can create where they feel it will be safe. I think other districts have, set up graduation in such a way that I think they feel that they can control those, and obviously would shut it down if anything occurred contrary to that. But again, I think what the concern is just sort of this blanket statement from ISB without sort of considering some of the more specifics that people are setting up right now.
Right. I think that gets into, I always wish we could bottle up for our conversations that we have in preparing for these webinars, because we had a really great, robust conversation earlier about how there are differences between different schools and school districts and who it would be possible to do something that would be safe. But I think our question is, if there is a way to do it safely, where can those schools, what can they do at this point in time? We had quite a few questions about the impact of a continued school closure on districts' responsibilities to continue paying all salaries, including for stipends for those who aren't performing essential functions such as teaching. Shelli, we did have a few specific questions, but could you give us a sense generally of what should be considered when answering the question of whether districts will have to continue to pay employees, even if school continues to be closed in full or in part in the fall?
Sure, I'll start, and then, if anybody else wants to jump in, but I certainly think, as it stands right now, we have the joint statement that came out that speaks to continued pay as if school were functioning normally through the end of this school year. To my knowledge, I don't know of any school districts that have, really pushed back legally on whether or not they have to continue that payment to everyone who would have otherwise been normally employed. If ISB comes out, or if there's another joint statement that comes out that extends that beyond the school year, I think we are then likely to see some school districts saying the impact of the funding issues that could impact those schools come next year or even the year after, they have to start being mindful of that, and you might see some pushback there. So there's the first piece of it that I think is, are we being mandated by some agency or by the governor's office to do that? And if not, then looking at what if there's a collective bargaining agreement that addresses it, what we have to do under the agreement with respect to, would we have to continue paying, for instance, if we did not run the stipended position? So I think that's twofold.
So we had some questions, some specific questions about types of employees and payments. So what about 10-month employees that can't work from home, security, monitors? Is our answer the same for those individuals?
It's a little bit different with them. I think that there is a difference in the school code related to the honorable dismissal of educational support staff, many of whom are our 10-month folks, and our licensed staff. So teachers, generally in that bucket. So under the school code, if you found that for whatever reason, either you didn't need them because school was closed or you couldn't afford them because of funding issues, you can, under the school code, dismiss the educational support staff with 30 days notice before the effective date. That is going to be something that I think we're going to see a lot of school districts looking at if we do not come back to school at the beginning of next year. Just do we have a need for these people in those positions, and can we afford them? I warn everyone, though, just to make sure that your agreements don't require something different than that, and making sure you're abiding by that if that's a decision that, it's a tough decision. It's not a decision any school board wants to make to let people go. But I worry it might become our reality if schools do not open in person in the fall.
Right. I think it's so important to remember, I think this is unique. We typically do not get people asking us how long it takes to RIF somebody if we do it September 1st. But that's a very common question. And the answer is, if you do it September 1st, the person leaves October 1st. And so you do have some, as long as your collective bargaining agreement doesn't say otherwise, you do have some flexibility here to make decisions more in the moment about the situation when you confront it, and not trying to predict sort of an unpredictable, setting.
Now, some schools have expressed specific concerns about paying if there's a cancellation of fall sports, paying for stipends when no work will be done. Do we have any insights on payments for stipends such as fall athletic coaches?
Nicki, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, again, at this point, the guidance that we have in terms of paying stipends, which has been a remarkably, I think, contentious issue for school districts. We get a lot of questions about stipends. Again, as Shelli had pointed out before, the guidance that we have from ISB, the joint statement, talks about through the end of this school year. So that's what we're paying stipends. We will await any further guidance regarding the fall. Obviously, you need to also look at your collective bargaining agreements. But it is a possibility that, if fall sports, if we are remote learning at the beginning and fall sports don't move forward, that stipends won't have to be paid. Again, back to sort of Jen's point about ISB's authority here, it'll be interesting if another joint statement comes out about that, what their position is, and whether districts, if they are requiring stipends to be paid, whether districts push back at that point. Because again, I think there are a lot of concerns about revenue and budgets, and it's just going to be more acute when we're looking at things like fall sports that aren't taking place. So I do think we're going to see a lot of conversation around that.
Yeah, I don't see how there won't be some pushback to paying these, just because they are a significant amount of money in certain districts, sometimes as much as, $1 million or more. And you think about, it's clear that people work hard when these things are going on, and it's a very sort of selfless, dedicated thing to run a big sport or a big club, and it's a lot of time. But if it's not happening, do we have the money, considering the competing needs that we have, to continue to pay people for doing very minimal work in comparison to their typical very hard work?
Yeah, that's a great point, Dana. Because I mean, for example, as we know, a lot of school districts, particularly big high school districts, have multiple football coaches, for example. So even if we have a football coach, one sports coach now who's sending out wonderful communications with their students, what are you going to do with 9 coaching stipends for football teams? It's going to be hard.
Yeah, Nikki and I know a lot about football. It's our secret. No one knows about it. It's on the secret. It's down low, on the down low.
Now, along the same vein, before we jump over to some of the Q&A that we've received today, Shelli, do you believe our schools and district will be impacted financially with widespread budget cuts and reductions in force during the 2021 school year because of COVID-19? How protected are district employees?
Well, I mean, I think that it's very likely that we're going to see some significant impacts, maybe not directly in 2021, but certainly in the next school year. We're going to see likely impacts on all school district budgets, and having to really look at that and see where their needs are. I think to the point Dana made earlier, I mean, just even if the funding doesn't change for next year, the idea of paying 9 football coaches to not coach football, instead of taking that money and putting it back into our kids in a way that's actually benefiting them, just doesn't make good sense if we're looking at this as a student-centered, as I hope we all are. I think to answer the second part of your question, how protected are the employees? As I mentioned before, the educational support staff have a 30-day window under the school code, different than our licensed staff, so our tenured and probationary teachers, who that's 45 days before the end of the school term. And then you have other employees that might be impacted by looking at their contracts and seeing what those require. So I think the level of protection is likely going to drive where the district makes tough decisions, depending upon when in the year they need to make them.
So looking over to our Q&A now, we had a question that was special education related. How long can we actually extend SLD or evals in general? How long is too long? Can we extend an eval through fall without making eligibility decision? Jen, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is it's
64 days, right, Jen?
Yeah, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Because if you finish the evaluation without information that was critical to make the decision, then you're in jeopardy. So you finish it, but you can't show your evaluation was appropriate. You're vulnerable to the parent's going to ask for an IEE, and you have no defense. You have to fund that IEE. So what I think the better position right now is rely on ISB's guidance, say we're going to finish it when we come back in the fall per their guidance. Now, if we never come back, at some point, we're going to have to finish these. And you are, like I said before, we're probably not going to get a waiver of this. So it is a procedural violation at that point. So I think one thing we need to do between now and fall is figure out, are there other ways to gather information? What are our new ways of doing evaluations? Because we can't keep saying we can't do this until we do face-to-face, if face-to-face is never an option. So right now, work with your testing companies. What tools can be done remotely that we didn't necessarily know could be when this all started? what are new kinds of skills that are important to be a remote learner that we maybe want to be assessing that wasn't on the original domain. You know, we have to look at these differently and then find a way to bring it to conclusion. I would want to do that within 60 days of the start of the school year. You know, you're wrapping it up. Otherwise, it really, I think, will have gone on too long, and you are vulnerable there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the other important thing to look at is when you're considering what your timeline is, look at what you already have. Like sometimes districts get very hung up on the timeline, and I get that, and you think you need more information. But if you have a situation where a kid has been struggling since first grade and he's in fourth grade, and you have RTI'd him or MTSSED'd him to death, you don't really need to hold back to do another piece of testing. You don't. So you want to make these decisions on an individualized basis based on the universe of data you have about each child. And some of them you're going to be able to put off more easily than others based on what you already have in your files.
Okay, another question here is, so is there anything that would supersede a CBA? If we don't return in the fall and our CBA says we have to notify our support personnel of RIFs by April 1st, do we have any way to release support personnel?
Likely not without bargaining something different with the union. I guess I would say before that, remember that not all of your support staff are likely in your unit. There are likely going to be some who are out, and not to say that those necessarily are the people that you might be able to release in the event that you needed to. But the agreement, you know, we try to encourage districts to continue with the school code language that was, I think, developed for precisely this reason, for districts to be able to determine what supports they need throughout the school year, as opposed to, you know, the teaching ranks that get noticed at the end of the school year. So to the extent that you've bargained something different in your contract, if it really is going to be a budget reason, you're going to, for instance, need to lay off a whole lot of people the next year because you aren't able to do any of it this year. I mean, maybe going to the union and talking to them about the potential impact that could have, and are they willing to make any sort of concessions for this year to avoid some sort of larger mass layoff long term.
Okay, and then we got the question, what are your thoughts about Plan B development of teacher evaluations in the context of remote learning? Are there any discussions about that?
So I'm assuming that question means how will the teacher evaluation process change when so many teachers are delivering instruction exactly the way we're doing it right now? And how will that impact your evaluation instrument and just the requirements generally for observation, for consultation? And I don't think anyone's really thought of that yet, truthfully. I think they were busy trying to finish up the evaluations that were already in process and get in good shape for the non-tenured, non-renewals and all of that kind of stuff. But I do think it's something that if what Jim said earlier in our program comes to fruition, and we are going to see teaching that's combination online, combination in person, then there is a whole new set of skills. And I am not eavesdropping on my K through 12 student, but I am eavesdropping on my college students. And I will tell you, because I pay for that, and I will tell you that some of the professors are way better at putting things online, and that's part of how they're going to be critiqued going forward. And this might be something that we have to put in our evaluation instruments. What do you think, Shelli?
I think you're right about that. I mean, I think that, to the extent that we've got districts right now who are figuring it out, for those tenured teachers who would not get their evaluations completed yet, and they're figuring out how to do some of the observations remotely, that'll be a good first step in that direction. But I think that, looking at every component of our world in teaching that has timelines or in-person requirements related to it are going to need to be kind of assessed from a higher level to say, preventatively, what can we do to look at how this might need to change
if this were to ever happen again, or we ever found ourselves in this situation again. I just want to remind everyone also, the appeal process for unsatisfactory evaluations has not been extended. So to the extent that you all are out there and have not bargained this with your unions yet as to what that's going to look like, please be sure to do so, because that's one thing that, at least for right now, has not been changed. So you're going to be expected to have that ready to go next year.
Yeah, and I think, Shelli, to that end, we are going to send out some information on that in the coming week. And so, happy to help sort through those issues. I do think evaluation is one of those, as you sort of put it, many pieces in the sort of kaleidoscope that are going to have to change or be thought about, particularly if we start talking about extending school years or adding in new components. Like, where do you give? Like, you can't do everything and sort of get everybody back up to speed and expect that everything is going to remain consistent. So, as Dana said, I haven't heard a lot of talk yet, but I'm certain it is coming.
Now, in the special education realm, I would say that probably the biggest issue that we received questions about was compensatory education. So I wanted to talk about that before we end. So I think the biggest question is, we all know that there's a risk that schools are going to have to deal with having a significant amount of compensatory education for special education students whenever it is that we get back to school. Is there anything that they could be doing now to mitigate that risk or to minimize the level of comp ed that they might have later?
Yeah, so I mean, the key thing is try to create a record where you can argue you provided FAPE. And I mean, I think I'm still thinking through what the best approach is for districts, but I think we want to individualize and we want to force this to be a student by student determination, not group all schools together, not group all students together. So there originally, and I still hear a lot of talk about, en masse comp ed and even appointing something like a special master. I am really trying to push against that in the advocacy that we do. I think that, for a lot of kids, it's not appropriate. They are getting service, and especially one thing that's happening is if you're overly concerned about, so special ed kids, sometimes they have to do all the gen ed work, and then they're getting essentially work from their related service providers and work. So we have to find a balance and collaborate that so that it doesn't accumulate. We're not doing en masse comp ed. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit. Your childhood's only so long. Your education, K-12 the idea that you can just make stuff up at some point is false. It's a false construct. And so now is the time to support students. There's no guarantee that anything can be made up. And so that's the approach I think we need.
And I think to that end, I think that you want to listen to your staff here. I absolutely agree that we do not want some sort of carte blanche comp ed program for all of these special ed students. It absolutely needs to be an individualized basis. But where I have heard concerns and where I also share the concern and the worry is for the profoundly disabled. The nonverbal kids, the kids that are not firm in their sort of basic skills of daily living, the ones that are engaging, that may suffer from more severe autism or other developmental disabilities where they're engaging in repetitive, behaviors for hours during the day, and remote learning may not work for them. As restrictions ease, I've talked to some clients about if we can't get school staff to go in the home, if the parents have private providers or there's people that do outside service, just maybe contracting with them for an hour a week just to do some respite. I think doing that now will build the goodwill that you need to face whatever's coming in the fall.
Time flies when we're having fun, I guess. We're almost done. Jennifer, as one of the editors of our Title IX Insights blog, I'm not going to let another webinar end without asking you a question about where are we, what should people be thinking about on Title IX? Where are we with that issue?
So somewhat unbelievably, we could be getting new Title IX regulations at any time. And we've been saying that for about 2 years, but recently the regulations actually made it through some formal process that had to take place. They could literally be dropped on us at any time. And so we keep waiting for that. If that happens, everyone will have to take a fresh look at if whether their practices complies. There will be changes that you have to make to your policies and procedures. So just keep a lookout on that. As unbelievable as it sounds that right now we'd have these regs dropped on us, there have been rumblings that that very well could happen.
And make sure you're still dealing with any Title IX complaints that you're receiving. There is no break from any of that because of COVID-19. Thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to having this conversation with you every week, and we're grateful for your questions and for your interest. Please look out for us next week. And in the meantime, if we can answer any other questions, reach out to any one of us and we'll be happy to help. Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.